Hi, I'm Rochelle Gentile, president of the Dubuque Symphony Orchestra League. I'm here at the Dubuque Golf and Country Club, kicking off our virtual Soundbites series. Under normal circumstances, you'd be right here with me, enjoying a great lunch and a preview of the DSO's upcoming concert, and I'm sure you will be again soon. As you may know, the DSOL develops and administers projects, programs, and events that provide music education opportunities to folks of all ages, as well as financial support to the DSO and its youth ensemble programs. Each year, the League contributes support to youth education events and programs such as the 3rd and 5th grade Arts Trek concerts, the 4th grade Adopt a Musician program, the Youth Concerto competition, the Dubuque Symphony Youth Ensembles, and the Summer String Camp. Along with our many other endeavors is our Senior Classics program, now in its 9th year, providing performances by DSO musicians to entertain residents and their families at local nursing homes and assisted living centers. While the past year has looked a little different, we continue to focus our efforts on fundraising. We encourage and welcome you to join us in our 54th year of supporting the DSO. Please check out the DSO's website for more information about how you can get involved. We hope to see you soon, but before I go, I'd like to introduce our esteemed music director and conductor, Dr. William Intriligator.
Thank you, Rochelle, and welcome everybody. I'm excited to share with you some thoughts about the program that we have coming up for our Classics 2 program in March here. You'll notice that several of the works on the program are works from the Baroque era. Just like with Classics 1, when we had music by Bach and Vivaldi, among other pieces, we're having music on Classics 2 by Corelli and Albinoni. And you might wonder, why so much Baroque music? Well, just to step back a little bit, let's talk about how the orchestra really evolved over the course of hundreds of years. And in the earlier days, like the Baroque era, orchestras were smaller and they performed in smaller venues, in rooms and in palaces, sometimes beautifully decorated rooms, of course, and sometimes larger rooms in palaces, but still not the modern concert hall or other larger venues that were to develop later on in the 1900s and so forth. The instruments of the orchestra are also still being developed. So early on we had, in the Baroque era, lots of music for string instruments, harpsichord, some flutes, an occasional oboe, an occasional trumpet, and those instruments were, those wind instruments were nothing really like, well, they were pretty far from their modern versions of those instruments. The violins, violas, cellos, basses, and harpsichords, however, were very much like the modern versions. Of course, there were many different styles of harpsichords, and it also depended where the harpsichords were made. There were different kinds of techniques used for that. But one thing that's interesting is that as we go back farther in time to the Baroque era, the late 1600s, early 1700s, the period before the classical era in classical music, before Mozart and Haydn, we have composers like Bach, Vivaldi, Corelli, Albinoni, and many others, and the instruments available to them at that time were primarily string instruments and harpsichord and these Baroque versions of some other wind instruments. But it's important to note that instruments like, for instance, the clarinet weren't even really developed at that time, and they weren't being written for because of that. Trombones were considered church instruments for a long time. Didn't enter the symphony orchestra until Beethoven included them in the finale of his 5th symphony in the early 1800s. Gradually, orchestras got bigger and bigger as more and more wind, brass, and percussion instruments were developed or brought to places where these composers lived. You know, it makes me think of the percussion instruments that were maybe very established for a long period of time in places like Turkey, but when they were finally brought to Vienna, maybe that's when, things like certain kinds of cymbals, triangles, and drums and things started to make a bigger presence in the sort of Western canonical classical music tradition. Of course, there was always timpani. That goes back quite a ways. So to get back to the question of why there was why there's some Baroque music on Classics 1, as there will be on Classics 2, has to do with, because of the pandemic, we have to limit the size of musicians that we have on the stage at Five Flags. And with a smaller ensemble, it's sometimes a great opportunity to play the wealth of just gorgeous, beautiful music written for a smaller ensemble, written for these smaller rooms in the 1600s and 1700s. So our Classics 2 concert will begin with a beautiful Concerto Grosso by Arcangelo Corelli. Yes, his first name is sort of like the Italian version of Archangel. Corelli was a violinist himself, and he was born outside of Bologna. Spent most of his career in Rome, actually. He was very successful in his day, and he is attributed to developing the idea of this Concerto Grosso. You know that a concerto features a solo instrument or instruments with a backup supporting group. Well, in some ways, concertos have Corelli to thank for this kind of form. He was very early on, he was instrumental, no pun intended, in the idea of having a group of soloists set apart from the full group. And so in his Concerto Grossos, they have a few soloists that are part of the group, and then they sometimes play separately. And this was a wonderful way to create a great contrast in sound and dynamics in an otherwise pretty small ensemble, or a pretty small-sized little orchestra. And by doing this, he also was able to give more virtuosic parts to those few solo instruments and keep the majority of the other orchestra parts much more playable, maybe allowing them to be played by more amateurs or students and things like that, the parts that were not the solo parts. In these Concerto Grossi, there's a distinction made, and the terms are interesting. There's the concerto group, which is the small group, in our case of the Corelli that we're going to play. It's 3 instruments, 2 violins and a cello. And then there's the ripieno group, or the full group, as it's known in Italian, or the tutti, everybody. And that's the full group. And in these Concerti Grossi, there's a wonderful balance between them. They go back and forth. Corelli's most famous Concerto Grosso is the one number, I think it's Opus 6, number 8, and that's called the Christmas concerto, and it's sometimes played at Christmas time. It has a beautiful pastoral last movement, but the one that we're going to play is number 11. It's the penultimate in this group of 12 Concerto Grossi, and it's gorgeous. I chose it because, like in typical Corelli fashion, it has beautiful suspensions harmonically that resolve. It has wonderful parts for the soloists, and then the orchestra come in. The back and forth is really great. It has a number of movements. Actually, in Corelli's music here, this Opus 6, he didn't publish a lot. Actually, these pieces were published the year after he died. Before he died, he tried to collect them and get them published, but he died before it could be published. But his student ended up finishing the task and getting it published. And actually, with the publication of these in 1714, they became really well known and influenced a number of other great composers like Bach and Handel. Handel loved them so much that he created a set of Concerto Grosso, also Opus 6, just like the Corelli Opus 6. The Opus number just refers to the number in publication. Anyway, so I was just saying that Corelli has this group of 12 Concerto Grosso that he put together from having written them over the course of decades. This one was probably from the early 1680s. In other words, just around the time that Bach would have been born, this piece was written. So Corelli is like the generation before Bach, early Baroque. And so one of the interesting things about his Opus 6 collection of 12 is that there's a group of them that are called the sort of church Concerto Grossi, which don't have dance music and dance movements. And then there's the group of the last maybe 4 or 6 that do have kind of a dance music kind of style. And so this one that we're performing is part of that style that has the dance music. It's not one of the church ones. It's kind of da camera, it's called. It's of the chamber, meaning just for a room in a palace. And so we'll have old-fashioned dance forms like the allemande, the courant, the sarabande, the jig, gavotte, minuet. You've heard some of these terms in classical music concerts. They're all, kind of outdated dance forms. But in the 1600s and 1700s, everybody would have known and recognized the qualities that made a particular music that particular dance. So Corelli had a long, successful career. He worked for 2 cardinals, and he worked for the Queen of Sweden, who was based in Rome for decades, and Queen Christina of Sweden in the 1600s. So that was interesting. In this piece, you'll hear our wonderful solo violins, Eleanor Barch and Peter Malicki. And you'll also hear our acting principal cello, Philip Bergman, playing the 3 solo parts. But you'll also hear the full group, and when I say full, it is a smaller ensemble of the Dubuque Symphony Orchestra, socially distanced on stage. And hearing the back and forth between the full and the soloists will be lovely, and this piece is just so gorgeous. Honestly, I heard it on Sirius XM while I was driving, and I was like, I love this. I need to program this sometime. And then when the pandemic hit, this was our chance to program pieces for a really small group like this. I think you're really going to enjoy the Corelli Concerto Grosso. There isn't too much other music by Corelli. Mostly he's known for these Concerto Grossi, and it's amazing that he really was a very influential composer, because once these were published after he died, they went on to be emulated by so many other composers later on. But he was kind of one of the first to do this idea. Concerto Grosso literally just means large concerto. And that's what it is. It's large because it's not just one soloist, it's 3. That explains a little bit about that. The Albanoni Adagio is also on this program, and one of the unusual things about that piece is that it's probably not written by Albinoni. It's his most famous piece, but he didn't write it. It's kind of an interesting story. In the 1950s, an Italian musicologist, let me get his name right. It was Remo Giazzotto. Yeah. After World War II, in a ruined library in Dresden had been heavily bombed in World War II, he supposedly found a fragment of music by Albinoni, like a little piece of music, and then he elaborated it and fleshed it out. And by elaborating it and fleshed it out, he created this beautiful adagio that has become so famous. It's been featured in films and other things like that. But many people have said that, nobody other than Giazzotto actually saw that fragment. And it could be entirely his own composition. Some people have even speculated that the musicologist probably had the rights and was probably made a fortune off this piece. But some good came of it, not just because it's beautiful music, but because Albinoni's name might not be as well known if it hadn't been for this adagio, which he probably didn't write. Even if Albinoni had written a fragment of it, the fragment that the musicologist supposedly found, he supposedly just found a bass line and a few bars of the melody. But it is a gorgeous piece. It doesn't really matter who wrote it. I'm excited to perform it. It's going to be great, and the audiences are going to love it at our Classics 2 concert. A lot of Albinoni's actual music is kind of a lot like Corelli's. The Concerto Grossi, sometimes for multiple oboes, sometimes for multiple violins. It has a lighter, kind of more elegant, less emotional kind of quality than the Adagio, which also maybe makes people wonder, the Adagio is probably not by Albinoni. But it's interesting, isn't it? So music, sometimes was borrowed, rewritten, plagiarized, stolen, passed off as somebody else's. I mean, if this musicologist wrote this beautiful piece and wanted it to be well known, it would probably be a great way to do that, to discover an previously undiscovered Baroque masterpiece by a little-known composer, but just known well enough that he was established. Tommaso Albinoni is a name that, in the classical music world, that's known. He's written some concertos and other things. So I don't know. I don't know the whole history about how much deception there was, or if he really did find a piece of music by Albinoni that inspired him, and then he just fleshed it out in a way that he thought Albinoni might have done. The piece is very beautiful. Here, I'll play you a little bit of it. I was also remiss not to play you any of the Corelli, which I can do as well. Here's a little bit of the opening of the Albanoni Adagio. Because the musicologist found this fragment that he thought was church music, he scored it for strings and organ. So an organ sound is part of it, creating that effect of a church. Beautiful, isn't it? You probably kind of recognize it because it has, as I said, been used in films and things like that. I was just rereading a few notes that I had on Corelli. I want to play you a little bit of the Corelli because I skipped over that. Here's a little bit of the opening of the Corelli. One of the things my notes mentioned I wanted to mention too is that, the Pantheon in Rome, that beautiful, it's kind of like a fancy mausoleum, really, the one with the hole in the middle of the dome. That's where Corelli is buried, right next to the artist Raphael. Pretty cool. So this is the Corelli that we're going to play at the beginning of the concert. Peaceful, isn't it? This is so beautiful. I'll jump ahead to another movement you can hear. Let's see here. Let's try this one. There are several short movements in this piece. You can hear the soloists in this one. The soloists don't play a solo part in every one of the short movements. There are 6 short movements, but certain ones they featured more than others. And what's also typical for Baroque music is that although there are 6 movements, the whole piece is only 10 minutes. In a Romantic era piece or a 20th century piece, if there were 6 movements of something, that would probably be 60 minutes. But this is about 9 or 10 minute long piece. Nice short little movements. It ends with a jig, some people have said the last movement, the jig, has a sort of a nod toward British music or a British style, which is kind of neat because we also have a British composer on this program too, Edward Elgar. I'll tell you about him later. Here's a little bit of a later movement here. The jig. We think of jigs as being Irish. But I guess when composers in Italy wrote a jig, they were thinking specifically of probably the British Isles. It's a lovely piece. Similarly, there's a movement called the Allemande, which is one of the dances, and that's a specifically German-style dance, and the word Allemande literally means German. So with these two pieces by Corelli and Albinoni, we have beautiful Baroque music, one by a composer who was one of the early masters of the Baroque and whose Concerto Grossos influenced generations of later composers, and the other, and actually a piece by a 20th century musicologist, but a kind of inspired by Albinoni. I think you're going to enjoy them both, and thank you for watching.